Is this all being brought about on purpose? Are we being steered here by the powers of the darkness, the controllers of the darkness of this world? I feel like we are.
In no uncertain terms, every time you need, in order to formulate an agenda that is successful for every single major world war, every single major conflict, the architects of our society, the engineers of our society, the custodians of our lives have found that the best way to do that is to foment animalistic revenge, vengeance. In order to do that, they have to literally set up a means of mass murder to take place, because fundamentally you're going to need soldiers who come from civilians to become trained murderers. Every soldier is a trained murderer. You have to desensitize them. Like we've talked about in the past, the book On Killing, which goes through the systematic desensitization training that is required in order to get a human being to resist the natural proclivities to not kill another person. In order to do that, you have to physically train them away. You have to dehumanize their targets. And every time, if you go back and examine the propaganda, one of my favorite studies is, oh my goodness, hold on. There is a video series, a documentary series, which you guys absolutely love, which is put out back in the 1950s. It went and examined the propaganda that was used in the 1940s during the war, as also after the war was kind of drowning out, and they began to shift it towards our what used to be our allies, the Soviet Union, who had to become the new bad boogeyman, the threat of communism. It's called Why We Fight, the documentary series. It's in the United States National Archives, and you can see it's like a 7-part series. And you can just literally watch the evolution of propaganda from the beginning phases of the war, because you've got to go back to each one of these time periods in United States history. Before the Spanish-American Civil War took place, the United States had a much more reserved stance when it came to global policing. But one of the key founders who instituted that was Woodrow Wilson, like you talked about. He became the shot caller of the Federal Reserve and a lot of these agencies. He was an economic professor, somebody who brought in the war through the economics, but he also was the one who brought into the population this mindset, this ideology that, we needed to go be the global policeman who step in on these powers and these positions. The same president who was like, I will not get us involved in the war, was the very president who got us involved in the Great War. And you go back a step further when you go back to the Spanish-American War, and the United States had agents of influence who went and set up the United States to have a destroyer blown apart in the sea in the Spanish Sea there by Cuba, in order to try to launch and foment this. And this is when they had what was called yellow journalism, the rise of a lot of the propagandists, the PR campaigns for the Secretary of War, the Secretary of Defense that we call him today, the Department of Defense. They used to call it the Department of War back then. It's really 1984. If y'all haven't read a book, I read a book recently called 1984 by George Orwell, which was just incredibly revealing. I've heard it quoted a lot throughout my life, but to actually sit down and read that book, you literally get to see the very architected system that was described and prophesied by these prophets of Baal. George Orwell was. He brought forth this great magical working, and literally mankind has been under the influence of this great dragon to bring this work to pass, because these archons, these ancient immortals, and what I mean by that, they were literally created to do mighty deeds. They were created to govern countries, continent, regions, territories of power and influence. And they are the ultimate ones who drive these forces into action. They're the ones who release the dogs of war. And they do that by setting up the population to be foaming at the mouth, like you just described, through the death and the destruction of innocence, more or less, people that are like they should not have died, even though when they knew, more often than not, it was the very agents of our government or the government that's going to victim stance during it that set them up. You got 25-mile long strip, the Gaza Strip, 5-mile wide, one of the most heavily enforced, guarded territories on the face of the earth. You got 2 million people inside that little area, and yet they have the most sophisticated drones and surveillance state, guardians, soldiers, and sentinels, incredible amounts of firepower and protective measures laid in place, sensors, ground sensors, air sensors, radio sensors. They have so much surveillance going over that place. And you want to tell me that these guys got in little tractors and drove across the border and devoured and destroyed all of these people? Surely you must understand something. Just like when the Japanese were coming over in their armada to destroy all of our ships that were so strategically laid out, these old battleships that the United States Navy didn't want to have to use for the next war, we lined them up so perfectly and strategically so that they could indeed come in and devour and destroy them. And so the United States could have this bloody sacrifice, this Holocaust, like you talked about, so that the people would be foaming at the mouth, willing to do whatever it takes to get it. It's the same as the Lusitania. The Lusitania back before World War I was a vessel that was carrying munitions. It had unbelievable tolls of munitions on it. It had literal artillery rounds for firing back at ships. It was a war vessel carrying all kinds of wars and munitions to go and start and engage in combat for the United States, on behalf of the United States, for Great Britain. And it was sunk, and they're like, oh, this great tragedy is taking place. And they used that through that yellow journalism, that same foaming at the mouth version of media, to drive the population into the direction that they wanted to, because ultimately the United States, by and far our population, has not bought hook, line, and sinker this ideology for the war in Ukraine. We're not really eager to go engage with a war with Russia and the Soviet Union again, because we recognize that there's some duplicitousness when it comes to, hey, who are these agents of evil that are operating at the headship and the leadership under Ukraine? And what is their driving factors? And why is it suddenly our government so behind their agenda? Could there be that there's some other double dealing taking place that's in this event? And